I'm Todd Vanderheyden. Good to have you with us from across the country. Older Canadians deserve better. That's the basic message today as new national standards are being rolled out when it comes to long-term care facilities nationwide. The standards are voluntary, but the goal here is to give those who run those facilities a framework and an outline to follow. Part of the reason for why now and why it's so important is to try and avoid a repeat of the deplorable scenes we all saw in the early days of the pandemic in our country. Thousands of elderly residents who died all alone, without their families nearby, in understaffed homes during the first wave of COVID, and countless others who were forced to live in deplorable and humiliating conditions, not getting anywhere near the care they deserved. This was a national embarrassment. It was a tragedy. Ottawa has now asked a nonprofit group known as the Health Standards Organization to come up with these voluntary guidelines for care homes and for the provinces to follow. They include at least 4 hours of direct care a day for residents, flexible visitor policies, upgrades to the construction, renovation of all the rooms where people are staying in, try to ensure there's some kind of a Canada-wide set of standards to properly respect. Our country's health minister commenting on this and whether the conversation will be part of upcoming healthcare funding talks between the premiers and the prime minister set to begin next week in Ottawa.
Well, it's both complementary and separate. We are working on all types of healthcare to Canadians and to workers, including long-term care, which is obviously very important post-COVID-19. Workers have suffered and patients have suffered enormously. So it's complementary. It's not the only piece of the healthcare conversations.
Vivian Stamatopoulos is standing by. She's a professor at Ontario Tech University, a long-term care advocate and researcher. Good to see you, Vivian. I appreciate you taking time for CTV.
Thanks for having me.
First off, your thoughts on these new voluntary standards and what they're going to mean.
I think you hit the key word there. Voluntary is deeply disappointing. And I think if we've seen so far to date in history, forget just during COVID alone, voluntary suggestions and goodwill and nice words on pretty paper get us not far at all, right? And as you pointed out at the jump of this interview, I mean, this was the worst mass casualty in our collective long-term care history. I mean, we've never seen anything like it. And we're sitting here talking about voluntary suggestions that would go through an accreditation scheme that is already underway and was underway before COVID and did very little to actually protect these residents. So I'm not sure how this amounts to anything more than a little bit of PR with no teeth to actually enforce these.
We covered it extensively as it was playing out in real time. And as you point out, it was heartbreaking to watch. It was completely shameful for a country of Canada's standard of living to sort of see this happen to those we should be protecting, the most vulnerable among us, who, deserved so much better. And our heart goes out to all the families who had to deal with this. In terms of these long-term care facilities, are you at all skeptical whether they will actually put this into place?
I'm massively skeptical. I don't see it happening. Frankly, I mean, the long-term care commissioners in Ontario, when we had our commission, pointed out the very fact that, Accreditation Canada considers long-term care homes its clients and can choose what they want to publicly release and not. So that in and of itself is a problem. And we've heard from families that you can have, staff ready on hand to be ready to check off what these, accreditors are looking for when they come to do their visits, so to speak. So it really doesn't amount to much. And, you don't even have all homes buying into it because they don't have to. Look at the response from an Ontarian, from, long-term care minister, Paul Calandra today, who just came out saying that, he has no intention of watering down the provincial standards, whatever that means, because we have none. With these federal suggestions. So it just shows you when you make it suggestions, you're going to get very little buy-in from the provinces because they're not mandated. What we wanted to see was federally, legislated standards, a handful of standards that would make sure that residents get a certain amount of care, ideally provided by a certain amount of full-time workers that are properly trained. Because keep in mind, the conditions of work directly amount to the conditions of care. And if you don't deal with the former, you're never going to have the latter. And that's our constant problem with this sector.
I thought it was interesting what we did hear from the provincial minister in Ontario who is responsible for this. And you just pointed it out, where he seemed to be saying, basically, Vivian, look, we're not going to, as you say, water down our standards. But I know Ontario was fiercely criticized during the pandemic for a lot of what happened. So again, there's a lot of noise. Help us cut through it. What do people at home need to know about, some of the spin that we're hearing from some of the politicians on this?
Yeah. I mean, what they have in place right now is going nowhere. And to follow up on that example about Paul Calandra, because this is important to note, he says that they're leading the country with this 4-hour care standard. By the way, that 4-hour care standard is a decade-old benchmark that really should be pushed up to 5 to 7 if you speak to experts in the area, which I have. And the issue is right now, the last estimate we have for the amount of direct care per resident that we're providing in Ontario, as an example, is 2.75 hours. And they're telling us we're going to get 4 hours by 2025. And not just that, and I testified ahead of the legislature about this, they're offering an average across the sector, which I pinpointed is wildly inappropriate because it means that the good homes, often the municipal homes who we know have more staffing and provide a greater amount of direct care per resident per day, their higher average will bring up the low performers, right? The bad actors. And it will make it seem like they're doing better than they are. And at the end of the day, the result will be that nobody actually has to implement the 4-hour minimum care standard per individual facility. And that's what we want to see, right? We want to see standards that actually require every single home, every single long-term care home in Canada to do X, Y, and Z. And right now, we're just giving provinces a loophole and a plan to circumvent that. And it's not going to get us anywhere.
Good conversation, and I appreciate your time and being as forthright as you are. We need to get that out there, Vivian. Thank you.
Anytime. Thank you.
Vivian Stamatopoulos joining